All right, well, a very good evening to everyone. Thank you all for being with us tonight. Welcome to our Vcsqi Virginia Cardiac Services Quality Initiative Winter 2020 virtual quarterly meeting. Thanks to everyone for choosing to spend your evening with us tonight. Hope everyone is safe and well, and you all have had a nice start to your holiday seasons, had a rejuvenating Thanksgiving, and are looking forward to the holidays. We have an exciting agenda tonight. We want to go over a couple brief housekeeping items first. I think this is not everybody's first Zoom rodeo, so you guys probably know the drill at this point, but a lot of the functionality is available via the participants button at the bottom of your window. Also, you can note Sherry's number here. You can call or text her if you need assistance. This is an open session, so feel free to unmute your line, raise your hand, speak up either via your microphone or via the chat box. Your participation is welcomed and encouraged and really necessary for our group. So thank you for that in advance. And again, here's the little chat button if you don't know where that is, kind of in the bottom of your screen. Regarding CMEs, we are doing a different approach tonight. If you're logged in on Zoom, we will automatically include you on the CME roster, and we'll email you afterwards with instructions on how to claim these credits. This just prevents any confusion with the text attendance system that we had in the past. If you're only on the phone or your name is not recognizable in Zoom, just send us an email, shoot us a note in chat, and we'll be sure to add you to the roster. So tonight we have a number of our by committees, which we'll get to in just a moment. We also have two featured presentations, one from Dr. Wayne Batchelor, who will lead an interactive session focused on healthcare disparities in interventional cardiology. We'll also hear from Dr. Hunter Mahaffey, who will present his latest research on differences in concomitant MVR and Afib ablation rates across Vcsqi programs. These two sessions will demonstrate how a statewide collaborative can apply research together with data-driven quality initiatives to improve care for all. Thank you for being here with us tonight. And it's now my privilege to introduce Dr. Robert Shore, the chairman of Vcsqi. Dr. Shore.
Thank you very much, Eddie, and a welcome and thanks to all participating in our winter virtual meeting. To reiterate what Eddie said, it has been a very strange and challenging year. I look forward to the completion of 2020, and I hope, as Eddie mentioned, that all are well and stay safe. We have a robust and important agenda, and in advance, I want to thank all of the speakers and participants. I did want to give a brief update from the board. We wanted to acknowledge and give thanks to Dr. David Sain, who is going to be coming off of the board, and many thanks for all of his efforts and help. And we are welcoming two new board members, Dr. Pete O'Brien from Lynchburg and Dr. Nick Temin from UVA. To remind folks, we have on the board 4 administrators, 4 surgeons, and 4 cardiologists, striving for balance as we try to balance the healthcare in our Commonwealth. Among the things we talked about, we gave a brief financial update, which is still looks quite good for us. We are looking at next year's priorities, and the main things we talked about, but we'll revisit, are several items that are ongoing, including integrating the VHAC network and database with ARMIS into Vcsqi to greater engage the cardiology community and provided much needed information in the management of STEMI care. The integration of TVT and eventually expanding to include other registries, moving ahead with our CATH review, which we are pleased we are moving forward with in a very positive way. And additionally, we have several work groups, SHOC, which we'll get an update from, AKI in addition to others, but AKI, we had our first work group meeting today, which was wonderful. We're thinking about additional work groups, including same-day PCI as well. So that's a brief overview. I'm happy to chat offline with folks if they want additional information. And if you want to be engaged in any of the work groups that you're not already engaged with, please let us know. Thank you, and back to you, Eddie.
Thank you, Dr. Shore. And here's just a brief review of our Vcsqi strategic plan. With our mission to transform cardiovascular care to improve patient experience and value, vision of optimizing heart care outcomes through national collaboration, innovation, and research, and our core values of value-based best practices, collaboration and transparency, stewardship of healthcare and costs, quality and patient-centered, and innovation, data and analytic driven. And it's our goal for all of these tenets to be on display for you all tonight. So we will move ahead to updates from our committees. We have Dr. Cotter, who is the chair of our Research and Writing Committee. I don't believe Dr. Cotter is with us this evening. He has recently assumed the role of chair of our Research and Writing Committee, taking over from Gaurav Alawadi, who served in that role for a number of years. Dr. Cotter's goals including more interventional cardiology data as part of the Research and Writing group, and really applying different research initiatives and making sure they don't just stay in the academic realm, but they actually cross over to the realm of real clinical practice too. And we'll have a good example of that later on tonight with the Ablation study. I don't think we have Trace on the line either, but can we call on either Judy or Chris for an update from the Quality Committee?
Sure. We met together and we collaborated with the Maryland group, and it was a lot of attendance, and I think we all learned from each other. And we also had some of the slides from Michigan to go over some of the questions that they had done. And we didn't know this was going to happen, but Melinda from the STS actually joined us. So if we had a real sticky question, she would chime in on it. So it was a really great meeting. I think it was a great use of our time. I think we all learned. We still do have the outstanding question of the aortic question, when they use a composite graph, like what do you do when it's a surgeon fashion one, but that should be in the January FAQs, Melinda said. She didn't have time to get it in for this December one. But it was a great, great meeting.
Thanks so much, Judy. Sherry, I'm going to pass it to you next for perfusion and shock updates.
Okay, good evening, everyone. So I'm speaking on behalf of Dr. Tirani. He, like many of you, was called into a procedure because patient care is first and foremost important to all of us. There were 4 points that Dr. Tirani wanted me to update the group on and relate that group, and that is one, Dr. Tirani has worked with VHAC and Dr. Pete O'Brien in summarizing or cutting down the amount of questions that is included in the survey. So I believe it's about 19 or 20 questions. The second aspect that he wanted to point out, or to let everyone know, is that the committee is working very closely with the VHAC committee and working to utilize the resources of the organization to disseminate the survey, which will be happening soon. Our next meeting is scheduled for next Thursday, December 10th in the evening. And the next step is to develop a consensus common case reporting form to collect standardization of resources or data to help actually visualize the impact we can make. Those are the updates. Thank you.
Thank you, Sherry. And I believe perfusion is going to meet next week as well. We were scheduled to meet today, and that had to get moved.
Yes, unfortunately, there was a lot of, perfusionist was actually called in procedure. So we are going to reconvene next week for a meeting with the perfusion group.
And Eve has done a great job in leading that group, and we're making great progress in terms of understanding perfusion practices across the state, and it's a promising subgroup for 2021 as well. And last but certainly not least, I'll pass it over to Dr. Pete O'Brien for an update from the Virginia Heart Attack Coalition.
Terrific. Thank you, Eddie. Thank you, Sherry. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Great. Well, again, I'm very, very grateful to be a part of Vcsqi now, and also to partner with you all because I think that we share some of the same kind of goals and vision for improving cardiac care across the Commonwealth. I'm going to give a very brief update on the Virginia Heart Attack Coalition. Next slide. So for those of you who are not familiar with us, we are a voluntary statewide organization, and our mission, I think, is best summed up in the statement: to work collaboratively to improve the systems of care for the early recognition and treatment of all Virginians having heart attacks. We've been in existence since 2008, and we've made tremendous progress. But again, we are very excited to partner with Vcsqi and with the Shock Initiative, which I'll mention in just a moment. Next slide. So like many of you, we didn't really know how this year was going to turn out. We thrive on the face-to-face regional and state meetings, on getting out, teaching EMS, working with STEMI stakeholders, and suddenly we couldn't do any of that. But like many of you and like Vcsqi, we learned to adapt. We learned to start to do a lot of things virtually and in other ways. Our first ever virtual state meeting occurred in July of this year. It was quite successful. It was on STEMI in the COVID era. And it featured a couple of great speakers giving us the EMS perspective, the cath lab perspective, and the ER perspective on what STEMI care in the COVID era looks like, volumes, the certain challenges that occur with this patient population or with other patients just because of restricted access and resources and safety of staff and things like that. So that was a whole lot of fun, and we had about 100 participants. Next slide. So that led up to our second virtual state meeting, and that occurred this past November, just a couple of weeks ago. I usually will kick off the state meeting now with an update on VHAC across the state and what's, how we're doing and what our priorities are and what our plans are. So I was able to address some of the plans that we have with Vcsqi with the VHAC stakeholders. But then we had two excellent speakers. The first one was Greg Damer from Cardiology, who spoke about changes to the chest pain MI registry, how EMS performance will be measured, and some other things. And then Alex Truesdell from Virginia Heart and Inova Fairfax talked about cardiac arrest, when to take a post-arrest patient to the cath lab, or if to take a post-cardiac arrest patient to the cath lab. So I think very interesting. The feedback we received, very useful for an organization that is geared towards quality improvement, but also is made up of a lot of clinicians. So I think those were well received. Next slide. Which brings me to, again, something we are very excited about, and that is the launch of a VHAC Vcsqi joint registry. As many of you are aware, or were probably directly a part of, the Action Registry went away about 3 to 4 years ago. And that was really the backbone data-wise of the Virginia Heart Attack Coalition. We had, in the decade that we've been in existence, we managed to go from 7 hospitals up to 39 out of 40. There, I think there were about 40 PCI centers at the time. So we had just about every single PCI center in the state of Virginia signed up. It was a wonderful apples to apples benchmark comparison as to STEMI times and the rates of pre-hospital EKG usage and all those things that drive quality improvement in the STEMI realm. And then for a variety of reasons, the Action Registry is no more. We have 2 great registries now, Get With The Guidelines and Chest Pain MI. And even though they measure the same things for a lot of different reasons, and I won't get down to the weeds, the numbers don't exactly line up, and you're back to comparing apples to oranges, which led us to pose the question, would there be a way to bring this data together into one unified data registry? And that's when we began our conversations with Vcsqi and ARMIS. And I'm happy to report that we are on our way. We have 16 centers right now with data use agreements in hand that now incorporate several of those variables I just mentioned. We try to keep our data set to about 4 different points in the STEMI care world. And we're very, very excited about that. There are, at last count, 47 PCI centers in the state of Virginia, and we hope to sign all of them up at one point. I think this is a win-win because it brings together like-minded people. I think it also helps do what Vcsqi has talked about and is moving towards, which is to broaden participation, bring cardiologists and other providers under this umbrella. And again, at the end of the day, what we hope to be able to do is compare hospital A, B, C, D in terms of their first medical contact to balloon time, their percentage of pre-hospital EKG usage, let's see, door in, door out, transfer times, all of those things that are very, very relevant to our STEMI patients. Next slide. Well, I was afraid that I was going to steal Dr. Tirani's thunder tonight in talking about the shock initiative, but I know he can't be with us tonight. Benham approached us about a month ago with, I think, an absolutely phenomenal idea, which was to start a statewide cardiogenic shock initiative, really along the lines of what VHAC has done for STEMI care. He is working with an incredible group of experts at Inova Fairfax in this realm, but reached out to us because he hoped to utilize the networks and the relationships and some of the on-the-ground experience as to how you roll something like this out across the state. So the first step was to write a statewide survey and then edit that down to I think about 17 or 18 questions. This survey, which you'll be seeing very soon if you haven't already, collects some very interesting and relevant data. You know, how is shock treated at your hospital? You know, who treats shock primarily? What mechanical support devices do you use? Does everybody get a PA catheter? Just to get a general sketch of what shock care is like in Virginia in 2020. And then from there, ultimately, compare different institutions and I would imagine at some point try to unify around more standardized care and to compare outcomes and whatnot. Also hopes to start quarterly virtual shock clubs, kind of like a cath conference, bringing in hospitals across the state or across the region, and then ultimately regionalize systems of shock care. We know that standardized protocol-driven regionalized care is good, and that's really what VHAC has been based on. And I think it looks promising to try to organize shock around similar principles or similar practices. Next slide, please. So that's it. That's about a year's worth of activity in several minutes. Join us, like us, follow us on our website, on Facebook, on Twitter. I would mention the website, which is undergoing quite a bit of change right now because we hope to ultimately become a clearinghouse for STEMI education, specifically EMS education. But there are links to guidelines and there's more information about our organization if you care to check that out. And Eddie, that is all I have from VHAC tonight. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Dr. O'Brien. Before we move forward to our data views, I just want to actually go back a couple slides and reintroduce Eve Dallas, who's the chair of our perfusion group. Go ahead, Eve. I think you're muted. All right, well, maybe Eve had to jump off, I'm not sure. But again, look out for some email communications regarding next steps with our perfusion group. So let's jump forward again, and we are going to do a quick review of latest and greatest from our Vcsqi cath PCI data set and some updates on where we are with a couple data components to some different quality initiatives we're working on. So first, just an overall look in volumes here. As you can see, the dotted line represents approximately where the COVID era began in March, and a very large decrease in the April cases, about a 37% drop in total PCI volume and an 18% drop in STEMI volume. Rebounded almost up to pre-pandemic levels in May and June, still a little bit less than May, June of 19, but not as dramatic of a bounce as we saw in April. Feel free to stop me with any questions, comments, by the way. Here's an update on vascular access site by hospital. We are now up to even 60% of patients in Vcsqi being operated on radially, and under 40% via the femoral method. This is representative about the last rolling 12 months of data, 8,000 patients. But you see still a great deal of variation between hospitals, ranging from 10% radial to about 90 to 100% at a couple of the medium and small volume centers. So there's a lot of potential for standardization here. And we will delve into some of the specifics on outcomes by access site next. Here's an example of AKI, which ties into our AKI work group. This shows observed AKI rate for all PCI cases without cabbage. Notice there's a little bit smaller N. It's about 60% of the overall N, just because not all patients have a pre and a post crit drawn. But based on the data we have, there's about a 6% AKI rate for radial patients and 10% for femoral. Again, with a good deal of variation between each center. So we wondered, do femoral patients naturally have a higher AKI rate, or are they just higher risk patients and they would just naturally be predisposed to higher AKI incidence? So next up, we looked at AKI by risk group and access site. So NCDR has a calculation for predicted AKI, which we took in rough groups here of less than 3%, 3 to 4%, 4 to 5, 5 to 7, 7 to 15, 15 to 25, and greater than 25. And those were just groups where we had pretty solid ends for each section. And we did some comparisons of AKI rates by access site within each of those predicted AKI groups. So for instance, if you had a 4 to 5% predicted AKI and you were done by a radial approach, you had a less than 3% AKI rate, but by a femoral approach, it was 4.2%. And 3 of these 7 subgroupings were statistically significant. And of note, all of the subgroups saw higher AKI rates among femoral patients. So I'll pause here. Questions, comments, suggestions? This is the first look we're getting at this, this granularity of the data.
The next interesting piece will be like with surgery, applying cost to those patients and how much difference in cost as we look at trying to bend the quality cost curve.
Mm-hmm. And last time we had looked at cost, I believe femoral patients were actually just a hair cheaper than radial patients. So again, I don't know if that has to do with the patient mix, but it's something we need to look into.
Is that with the AKI, or is that does that include it, or is it broken out by AKI?
Just in general, femoral patients were just a hair less expensive.
Right. So we probably need to look at it in the context of AKI and the severity of the AKI.
Good point. And then we can kind of have complementary cost bars with each of these outcome metrics. I'll move forward. Our last slide here just shows an overall N in terms of shock patients and the data we have available in both cath PCI and STS. Across the last about 3.5 years of data, we have nearly 2,000 patients with shock who are either operated on or who had cath PCI procedures. And you'll see just based on the number of mortalities, how high of a risk that these patients really are. So we purposefully went light on the data tonight. We wanted to leave time for our excellent presenters, but I'll just make a note that these reports, along with the full sets of STS and cath PCI reports, will be distributed via our mailing lists. So please look out for those. Please feel free to suggest your ideas for how we can delve into the database, how we can apply results to see improvements in patient care and to complement our quality initiatives. So I would welcome and encourage everyone to participate in that aspect of Vcsqi. I think it's critical to help us derive meaning from this data. And if there are no questions or comments, we can move forward to our next segment. Dr. Shore, can I ask you to provide an introduction for Dr. Batchelor?
Fantastic. It's really a delight and a pleasure to have introduced Wayne, who will give us the talk on healthcare disparities in interventional cardiology. And I would say that since he has joined NOVA, it has been just a tremendous blessing. He also co-chairs an anti-racism work group for NOVA Heart and Vascular Institute. And I'm personally really looking forward to this discussion. I think everybody will be extremely pleased and engaged, and it's an engaging talk. So without further ado, Wayne, welcome.
Well, thanks a lot, Bob, and thanks to Vcsqi for the opportunity to share some ideas and some thoughts around healthcare disparities, especially as it relates to interventional cardiology. I want to take just a moment to also thank Alan Spear for really asking me and reaching out to me after another presentation I made on this topic. He kind of asked me to present this perhaps to the Vcsqi, and so I want to thank him for the opportunity and the board as well. So I'm going to try to share my screen, and then we're just going to get going. I'll ask if anyone has any burning questions, feel free to interrupt, but I've got a number of slides and I want to leave some time at the end for discussion, and I hope that that will be feasible. So hopefully you're seeing my slides. Is that, can everyone see that?
Yes.
Perfect, great. All right. Well, a discussion about healthcare disparities would be really empty without mentioning COVID-19. I think most of us recognize that this has been so dominant in our social life and healthcare life, and it's brought out some of the most dramatic disparities that we've seen in healthcare for a long time. So I just want to remind everyone of the current status of COVID-19. There are 64 million cases. We've had almost 1.5 million deaths and over 273 deaths in the United States. And unfortunately, when you look at the daily confirmed cases, we have the dubious honor in the United States of leading the pack by far. It's not even close vis-a-vis the numbers that are reported on a day-to-day basis. And if you look at how these curves are, this particular uptick is remarkable relative to the slope and also the lack of much of a decrement relative to other countries, including India and others that had significant surges. So we've got a lot of work to do, obviously, and in the next few months, hopefully with vaccination and other interventions, we'll see some improvement. Now, this slide I put up, it's a few months old, but I just wanted to put into perspective the magnitude of effect on mortality that cardiovascular disease has, even relative to COVID. I mean, know that COVID-19 has dominated our thought process, and this is an old slide. It estimated that deaths from COVID-19 would range from 60 to 240,000. We've already surpassed that. But I think current estimates are in the range of probably for the year, somewhere between 300 to 400,000 deaths are very plausible. But let's just think about how that relates to a year of cardiovascular disease deaths. Depending on what statistic you look at, this ranges from 400 to about 600,000 deaths per year due to cardiovascular disease. Cancers, a little under 300,000. And you can see in here suicide, Alzheimer's disease, drug overdoses, and stroke. So COVID's going to assume a huge proportion of our annual mortality. However, it's very possible that cardiovascular disease will still remain number one for the year. Now, the reason that it's important to talk about COVID-19 is that out of all the things that we've seen in the past several decades, probably COVID has brought to surface healthcare disparities more than perhaps any other recent healthcare issue. And if you just look at the data, no matter how you slice or dice it, there's about a 2 to 2.5 fold increase in the likelihood of dying from the disease if you're Black, and also incremental risk if you're American Indian, Alaskan Native, Hispanic, or Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander relative to white and Asian population. So this really is a disease of healthcare disparities, and I think it fosters a lot more discussion. Now, recently in JAMA, William Owen, who's former chancellor of the medical school at Ross University in Florida, he and his co-authors talked about the fact that COVID really brings out these healthcare disparities. And they quote them by saying, "We propose that the overarching cause of these tragic statistics is decades of the effects of adverse social determinants of health." So what COVID really does is it just magnifies pre-existing disparities that are largely related to social determinants of health. And COVID's not an equalizer, it's really a tester of differences, and it's a magnifier of these differences. And that's perhaps why we're seeing such a disparate number of deaths relative to race and ethnicity. And they call for, this was a several-month-old publication. As you can see, it came out in April, and that was in the early time of the pandemic, and they were calling at that time for COVID-related data on race, ethnicity, social determinants of health, and of course, multilingual and multicultural public service announcements to try to increase education. So this was an early call for really getting the data spun down to the level of race and ethnicity. And since then, of course, there has been more data that has come out, but early on, many states weren't really recording this and were not mandated to do so. If we're going to talk about healthcare disparities, it's important that we have in our minds kind of a definition. The Institute of Medicine defines healthcare disparities as basically being the portion of the gap between, in most cases, minorities and non-minorities in terms of healthcare outcomes. And if we think of this difference, we can divide the difference up into differences that are related to appropriate care and need, or patient preferences. If a patient refuses care or, for example, wants a particular different intervention, that's not really a disparity. The disparity piece is the piece that relates to the operation of healthcare systems, legal and regulatory differences, and how discrimination plays out, including bias, prejudice, stereotyping, and uncertainty. So it's really these two blocks of the difference that are key, not necessarily clinically appropriate differences in care or patient preference. It's important to understand what that definition is before we embark on a real conversation. Now, many have focused on social determinants of health, and I think contemporary views of disparities in medicine really relate most of the disparities to social determinants of health. And that can track through race, ethnicity, gender in some cases, and socioeconomic status. But if you think of social determinants of health, the overall impact of social determinants of health, most of it's related to a patient's physical environment, social determinants, and behavioral factors, whereas only 20% of it's thought to be due to access to care and quality of service. So the reality is it's where we live, what's around us, and how we behave in that environment that ultimately has the biggest impact on outcome. Now, the traditional divisions of social determinants of health include economics, neighborhood exposures and physical environment, education, healthy access to healthy food, social context in your community, and of course, access to adequate health care. So you can think of these basic pillars that support social determinants of health and can all influence social determinants of health. Sort of a more modern picture of this is, it's really nomenclature more than anything else, is this concept of geospatial determinants of health. And this is sort of really focuses on, it's really where you live. A lot of this is divided by race, but really race is a minor factor in social determinants of health and outcomes related to disparities, whereas where you live is a much more important factor. If you think of the most sort of impactful determinant of your lifespan, access to care, your economics, access to healthy food and good education, it's your zip code. It's your 9-digit zip code. That is an extremely strong predictor of healthcare outcome. And it's also a very good predictor of your ability to respond to stressors that come in your life. So there are sort of national stressors such as pandemics and hurricanes and natural disasters. And there are personal stressors, divorce, death of a loved one, et cetera. And so a lot of people in healthcare are talking now about this social vulnerability index, or your SVI. And you can measure the likelihood of someone having an adverse outcome, adverse health outcome related to a pandemic or to, for example, a hurricane or a personal stressor based on where they live, the county from which they reside. And a stark example of this is just, for example, close to us, there's a county called Carroll County in Maryland. And if you measure social vulnerability index, 0 is extremely low vulnerability, where you're extremely resistant to adverse outcomes resulting from acute stressors, to 1, which is the highest vulnerability. And if you just look at a heat map of social vulnerability index, here darker areas are more prone to adverse effects of stressors or a high SVI, and lighter counties are shown here. Let's just look at this SVI index for Carroll County. It's 0.03. Travel about 30 miles to Baltimore City, the social vulnerability index goes up to 0.8. That's a 23-fold difference in the SVI between these two counties that are only 30 minutes away. So just within small geographic regions, you can have tremendous differences in a county's ability to respond to stressors that naturally occur from day to day, month to month, and year to year. And I think it's this kind of concept that will teach us a lot about how we look at social determinants of health, healthcare disparities, and how we dissect through this with a lot more granularity than simply race and ethnicity. To quantify this impact of this black-white mortality gap, David Sasher, the former Surgeon General, back in 2005, I think he was probably director of the CDC back then, but he did a really nice, wrote a really nice paper on how the standardized mortality ratios have changed between black and white from 1960 to 2.0. And what he basically very nicely showed was there has been absolutely no difference in the standardized mortality ratio. It's basically 1.42 in year 2000. It was about 1.41 for blacks versus whites. In other words, about a 41% increase likelihood of a premature death in blacks versus white. And that has not changed in 40 years. So if we're going to really talk about closing the gap, we've closed the gap on housing, certain things, economics and other factors, although there's still huge gaps that exist. But it's relative to healthcare differences and differences in mortality, we've made very, very little difference on this black-white mortality gap. And this translates into 83,000 excess deaths per year among African Americans. Think about that, 83 excess deaths, and about a 4 to 5 year difference in average life expectancy. So this excess deaths is more than you'd expect for diabetes, more than influenza, more than suicides, more than Alzheimer's disease, in parallels things like chronic lung disease. So this is a huge difference that's just simply based on race. Now, disparities span many aspects of what we do in healthcare. And I think it's really important to talk about disparities in clinical research and clinical practice. For percutaneous coronary intervention, for example, whites account for about 64% of the population, but upwards of near 90% of overall PCI volume across the country, but also about 90% of clinical trial enrollment. I've just shown you sort of a demographic breakdown of patients who enrolled in some of the key pre-market studies from Boston Scientific, registries that led to the ultimate commercialization of standard stents we use in our day-to-day practice. And of these PMA studies, you can see that nearly 90% were white. Only women constitute only around 25%, and Blacks, Latinos, Asians, and others constitute very few numbers, 5% or less. And so there's a real difference or gap that relates to research enrollment. And because commercialization of these products often tracks back to the sites who do enroll the patients, there's also a slower way of sort of disseminating new technology based on race as well in our communities. We took notice of this. Dr. Moran and I were speaking to Boston Scientific years ago about this issue. And long story short, Boston Scientific discussed with us the concept of doing a registry. And they said, if you wanted to do a registry to try to combat this issue of disparities in enrollment in registries and clinical trials, what would you do? And Roxanne and I discussed this, and we said, what we would do is a registry of underserved patients. If you just allow enrollment to occur through sheer play of chance, every study you do is going to basically have 85 to 90% white men, around 20 to 30% white women, and very few minorities beyond that. So for basically 9 months, we did an enrollment of solely women and minorities in a stent registry. And we constructed this prospective design that was purposed to simply enroll for 9 months until we achieve those numbers and then move on from there. And that was called the Platinum Diversity Study. And that was different. That's the only study to date in cardiovascular medicine that has enrolled solely underrepresented minorities and women in a registry in order to get numbers adequate to draw comparisons to previous studies that had been done in predominantly white men. And the purpose of this was to mimic the exact same registry, the Promus Element Plus study, with the exact same endpoints, the exact same stents, and then try to draw some comparisons and outcomes to make some sense of this. And the other piece to this Platinum Diversity Study was we intentionally shortened the case report form, made it simple, and included social determinants of health, because we felt in this particular group, it'd be very important to understand how SDOH plays out in terms of outcomes and predictors of mortality at 1 year. So here's the study design. The Platinum Diversity enrollment, which was 9 months, we enrolled 1,501 patients of women and minorities. Then we also had a few minorities and some women also from the pre-existing Promus Element Plus post-approval study, of which 2687 patients were enrolled. We did a pooled analysis. These were contemporaneous studies done around the same time. We just paused and enrolled patients in the Platinum Diversity to get adequate numbers of women and minorities. And this is the largest study of women and minorities in a stent trial to date, or stent registry to date. This is the follow-up. You can see it was robust in all 3 arms. We were able to publish this in JAMA Cardiology a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, and it's the first study of its kind. I just want to highlight a few salient results from the study. And again, when you pool all this together in one single analysis of over 4,000 patients, you see that antiplatelet therapy adherence, compliance to dual antiplatelet therapy is very similar, 88 to 92% across white men, women, and minorities, with statistical differences because of large numbers, but clinically really very, very similar compliance rates. Now, how did outcomes compare? If you look at here, there was a gradation, unadjusted outcomes, such that MACE, death, MI, and target vessel revascularization was highest in minority women, statistically significantly different. than white men that were shown here as the baseline. Interestingly, minority men and white women did not show a significant difference in MACE rates over 1 year relative to white men. Now, if you look at the influence of diabetes mellitus, there was a real sort of impact of diabetes mellitus, especially insulin-treated diabetics, as it relates to gender and race. So if you look at here, this Kaplan-Meier curve at the bottom is for non-diabetics. The likelihood of a MACE event was 7.5% at 1 year with these everolimus-eluting stents, which is fairly contemporary and fairly typical of what we'd expect for a stent trial. But look at the numbers in minority women. Almost 20%, 1 in 5 patients had a major adverse event within 1 year in minority women. And you see there's a bit of a gradation of effect here with insulin treatment in diabetics, but it really had the biggest impact in minority women. A minority of women who are on insulin are really a high-risk cohort for recurrent events. That's the first time that's been shown in such a clear fashion. Now, when you look at the adjusted outcomes at 1 year and you compare to white men, women, or minorities, you see the following. For death and MI, there was a statistically significant increased hazard in women relative to white men. And for minorities, there was a significant increase in death and MI and myocardial infarction. MACE was not different, although there was a trend, and overall mortality was no different. But there is an increased hazard that relates primarily to recurrent ischemic events. And these are events that could not be necessarily tracked to the stents. These are new events that are occurring not necessarily from restenosis, but from more thrombotic or ischemic events over time. Now, one of the most important parts of this, this study was the part where we collected social determinants of health. So we asked every patient enrolled in Platinum Diversity, 1,500 patients, what country, their birth country, their language. We looked at language concordance between the site enrolling the patient, the PI, and the coordinator and the patient. Life situations, marital status, living situation, income, employment status, alcohol and substance abuse, BMI, exercise. We asked questions about exercise and the regularity of exercise, insurance, access to care, smartphone usage, distance to the hospital, etc. And we got a lot of information. And why is that important? Because if you look at all of the predictors of outcome that were independently associated with major adverse cardiac events, these are the predictors. Not surprisingly, cardiogenic shock, renal disease, and PVD came out as well as multivessel disease. But for the first time in any stent trial, we showed that 2 social determinants of health strongly predicted outcome. I thought this was fascinating. If you'd lost a loved one in the year prior to your stent, you actually had a significant increased hazard, a 2-fold risk of major adverse events driven mostly by myocardial infarction in the next year after your stent. And if you were widowed versus divorced, it was 2.6 odds ratio. Private insurance was protective. If you had private insurance, you're about 34% less likely to encounter a MACE event. So for the first time in a stent study, we're showing that social determinants of health come out in a multivariable model as strong predictors of outcome. And there's a lot of literature on the significance of losing a loved one and how it actually makes you prothrombotic and more likely to have a myocardial infarction. Really fascinating data on the stressors of major misadventures in life and how that can affect rates of both myocardial infarction, stroke, and death. Now, what's really interesting is if we just track back again to this, these Kaplan-Meier curves for major adverse events, mostly driven by myocardial infarctions in minority women, we started to ask the question, well, in the literature, is there any plausible explanation for this? You know, why does this disparity exist? I mean, what's it due to? And that 19%. Well, if you look into the literature, it's fascinating, but there is a very plausible explanation for this. And it's amazing that and the best literature came from actually Paul Gerbil, who used to be with Inova, and it's not Sinai in Baltimore, but his group, and he's an expert thrombotic investigator who's done just really a lovely volume of work relative to thrombogenicity. And he basically took patients who were coming in for elective heart catheterization and measured their thrombogenicity based on thromboelastography. And so this looks at platelet fibrin clot strength, and it's a very nice measure of your prothrombotic state, and it predicts future risks of myocardial infarction and other thrombotic events. And if you just randomly sample these patients as they come in for their diagnostic heart caths, who's the most thrombotic group? Women are more thrombotic than men, including women who have not been non-clopidogrel or who are on clopidogrel. Significant differences there. But of the women, the most prothrombotic phenotype was seen in Black women. And Black women are shown here in these bars. These are dark bars. And you see relative to white women, Black men, white women, et cetera, Black women were by far the most prothrombotic phenotype. So now we're starting to actually potentially connect some dots and perhaps even have a biological explanation for some of the things that we saw pan out in platinum diversity, especially with regards to diabetic Black women. And it turns out, I asked Paul Goebel this, I'm asking him to write this up, but it turns out that if you actually look at this thrombogenetic phenotype based on diabetic status, by far the most thrombogenetic group is Black female diabetics. They're off the chain when it comes to measures of thrombogenicity. So that tracks perfectly well with our clinical observations from the platinum diversity study. And in fact, when you look at the literature, we're starting to think about disparities and even impacts of stress, racism, and other sort of factors that relate to social stressors can actually have a connection to thrombosis, vascular inflammation, hypertension, and other adverse endpoints through probably activation of inflammatory markers, endothelial function. There's all sorts of things that happen when you're under stress, and that when stress hormones are released, angiotensin II is released, epinephrine levels go up. This can trigger ET1 activation and all sorts of adverse phenomenon. So we're actually starting to realize that there could be a connection between social and behavioral factors and actual activation of adverse pathways that lead to vascular injury, thrombosis, and other adverse endpoints. Let's talk a little bit now about TAVR. How does this play out within transcatheter aortic valve replacement in terms of healthcare disparities that might run across race and ethnicity? Perhaps the most eloquent and largest report comes from the TVT Registry. And that's the nice thing about TVT is you just get, by sheer force of the numbers, tremendous ability to study a number of trends over time. And if you look at the TVT Registry from 2012 to 2016, here's what you observe. 91% of all patients who underwent TAVR were white, only 4% Black. Remember that Blacks constitute about 13 to 14% of the US demographic, and only 3% were Hispanic. And if you look over time, between 2012 to 2016, there's virtually no change in those demographics. Under 4% Black, pretty well the whole way through, and about 3% Hispanic. Now, when you look at outcomes, really the nice thing is that for in-hospital outcomes, there's really no difference in outcomes according to race, ethnicity. And at 1 year, the only thing that you see is there's a slightly higher risk of major bleeds in Blacks and heart failure hospitalizations in Blacks and Hispanics. But in terms of getting through the TAVR procedure, really you're equally as well suited for TAVR in terms of your likelihood of a successful procedure without complication if you're white, Black, or if you're Hispanic ethnicity. Now, taking this a little further, Matt Brennan and some of his co-investigators at Duke and through the TVT Registry also looked at another question. And that is, if we just looked at EHR data from the Optum database over a decade of TAVR procedures, they came up with 32,000 patients who were newly diagnosed with untreated severe aortic stenosis. This is different because TAVR in the TVT registry are all patients who've been diagnosed and treated with TAVR. So that the denominator in the TVT registry is unclear. What they did here was they tracked patients who were newly diagnosed but yet not treated for severe aortic stenosis, and then looked at treatment patterns over the next year. Of these, it turns out that only 3.3% were Black, 0.6% Asian, and others, other minorities were 6.9%. And they examined the rates of TAVR, SAVR, and mortality after that diagnosis. So a much more thought-provoking question that relates to decision-making processes for procedures. And what they saw over time was shown here in SAVR is in the dark bars and TAVR in the light bars. No surprise, TAVR grew over time and surpassed SAVR by 2016. And the growth was similar across different races and ethnicities. But no matter how you sliced it, and if you looked at all the covariates in the model, there was about a 30% lower likelihood of getting TAVR if you were Black versus white. And over time, that bias tended to diminish. And that was, I think, somewhat reassuring, is that in 2011 to 2012, here are the odds ratios of getting a TAVR if you're Black versus white. That phenomenon seemed to be less in 2015 to 2016, such that in the latter part of the database, there's only a 14% difference in the likelihood of getting TAVR in Black versus white, given all the same covariates. Now, outcomes here, again, in both treated and untreated, were absolutely no different according to race or ethnicity, and that was reassuring to see. We wrote a review article on this. I'm blessed to be a part of the American College of Cardiology's Interventional Sexual Leadership Council, and we tasked the council with kind of coming up with a white paper on this under-treatment phenomenon that we saw in transcatheter aortic valve replacement. And as you can imagine, when you peel the onion, it becomes very complex. And these are not just purely one sort of factor decisions that come that lead to TAVR decisions. When patients present to us, there are a whole host of things that will ultimately govern whether or not they get a TAVR or a SAVR. And these are patient-related factors, which I've shown here, healthcare system-related factors, which I've shown here, and disease-related factors. How we present makes a difference. By the way, there might be differences across race and ethnicity in terms of your likelihood of developing aortic valve stenosis. For example, bicuspid aortic valve disease is much less likely and less prevalent in African Americans. We don't exactly understand why. And aortic valve sclerosis is less likely seen on echoes in Blacks versus whites. Hard to know because there's a referral bias for echoes, but there's some really fascinating literature on the fact that perhaps Blacks may not develop aortic valve stenosis to the same degree as whites. But once you're in the system, there are also treatment and diagnostic and referral biases that span race and ethnicity. And these are real, and there's a whole bunch of papers on this. I'd refer you to this review article to look at those papers if you want to get a little bit more information on this. And then there are patient-related factors, healthcare trust, socioeconomic factors, and some of the things that span social determinants of health that might also impact the likelihood of you getting a valve. I want to change gears just a bit to speak about this other underserved group, because when we talk about disparities, everyone just gravitates towards race and ethnicity and sometimes gender, but really a phenomenal disparity across our country is based on rurality, where you live and how close you are to a TAVR center. And I want to applaud Dr. Damluji, one of our Innova partners at the Center for Outcomes Research at Innova. Abdullah Damluji did a really elegant study. And what he did was he looked at the entire TAVR population in Florida over several years. And he looked at the likelihood of you getting a TAVR procedure based on how many patients lived in your county, or how many people lived in your county. So you can divide up Florida according to population density, with high density regions in red and lower density regions in yellow and green. And then you can track TAVR utilization rate according to population density. And whether you exclude, swampland or include it, no matter how you slice it, there is a 7-fold difference in the likelihood of you getting TAVR if you live in a high density, population density region versus a low density region. And by the way, mortality also is much better if you're in a high density region for TAVR versus low density. So the time to travel and your distance from a TAVR center actually also determine your likelihood of getting TAVR and also your predicted outcome. So this is really thought-provoking. So we cannot enter into a discussion around disparity without speaking, cogently about where you live and access. I'm going to spend a few slides talking about disparities in clinical trials, because this is something that's kind of near and dear to me, and I think this is a really important issue as it relates to the safety and efficacy data that we generate for the procedures and the pharmacologic interventions that we ascribe to our patients. As a part of the Food and Drug Administration Safety and Innovations Act from 2012, increased transparency was something that the FDA wanted to achieve. They also wanted to find out more information about patients who were underrepresented in clinical trials. And the key groups that they identified included women, minorities, and older adults. Those three groups are historically poorly represented in cardiovascular clinical trials and clinical trials in general. So as a part of the FDASIA Act, there was a lot more effort and emphasis placed on these particular arenas. So as a part of the transparency piece, the FDA every year or two will send out these reports, public reports on the demographics of clinical trial participants leading to drug approval and ultimately device approval in the entire world and according to the United States. So just by way of example, in year 2015, for all of the drugs that the FDA considered, 28% of those trial participants came from the United States, 72% from the rest of the world. In the next year, it was more 42% and 57% respectively. So, you know, a couple of observations. United States has a very important piece in contributing to FDA data, but not all of it. 3/4 of all of the data that went to the FDA in 2015 for drug approval was from outside the United States. You'll see why that's important in the next few slides. If you look at gender, the gender of participants globally in all the clinical trial data that went to the FDA in 2015, 57% of all the trial participants were male and 43% were female. But if you divide that up according to the rest of the world versus the United States, you'll see that United States is closer to 50-50 in gender representation. The rest of the world tends to have a bias in enrolling more men than women. Why is this important? Well, if we're going to do clinical trials and try to represent our population accurately, the pathway must pass through the United States in terms of good trial participant and enrollment. This is important, and this is actually a little bit of a positive factor on clinical trial participation in the United States. Now, when you look at race, if you look at how race plays out in clinical trial participation, for African Americans, the likelihood of African or Blacks being enrolled in a clinical trial, if you're out globally, is 5.4% in the entire population. If you're outside of the United States, only 1.3% of all trial participants self-identified as Black. In the United States, it's 14.5% in 2015. What does that mean? Well, in 2015, we did a pretty good job of representing Blacks, Asians, and Hispanics relative to the rest of the world. And so, again, if we're going to do good clinical trial work, the pathway must be through the United States for us to really have a demographic that represents our country adequately. Because again, this is going to lead to the ultimate determination of our safety and efficacy point estimates for not only our pharmacologic agents, but the devices that we implant in patients. So we want to make sure that this is representative of the patients who ultimately get these devices and drugs. We spoke about this, and I would refer you to this article in Circulation last year about how to overcome this lack of diversity in cardiovascular clinical trials. One of the take-home messages from this this white paper was we have to do trials in the United States to make sure that we're representative, because we do a better job. Now, a thing that's come up over the last couple of years relative to this real big movement to try to enroll more women and minorities in trials is I'll be honest with you, a lot of clinical trial academicians are wondering, well, how does this affect our ability to enroll? This is a big factor for industry. It costs industry on average $2 million per day for a big pharma drug. For every day that it's delayed to market, it costs about $1 to $2 million in terms of the ultimate ability to capture revenue from that drug later on downstream. So time delays are huge for pharma and for device companies. And if we're going to put a lot of emphasis on enrolling women and minorities, and they're inherently more difficult to enroll, what does that mean? Well, we tried to study this because of the natural phenomenon that we had from the Platinum Diversity Study and the Promus Element Plus study that I showed you. We had a lot of diverse sites and a lot of diverse patients. So we actually went through the experiment of rank ordering sites according to how diverse their enrollment was, from zero diversity, all white men for enrollment, to the most diverse. And so you can see here, these are sites just rank ordered in terms of what proportion of enrollment was in minorities and what proportion what proportion of total enrollment that constituted minorities and what proportion of enrollment constituted women. And so you can see that there was tremendous variability, with some sites enrolling huge numbers of minorities based on the Platinum Diversity enrollment, and some from Promus Element Plus enrolling no minorities at all and very little women, very few women. And then we actually asked the question, how did protocol deviations, site enrollment, that's number of subjects enrolled per 30 days, play out according to minority enrollment and female enrollment? That sort of asked the question of, if we divide up into quartiles, highest quartile minority enrollment versus lowest quartile minority enrollment, and simply look at how many subjects were enrolled in those sites and how many protocol deviations, a measure of quality of enrollment, it turns out there's absolutely no difference. If you're enrolling tons of minorities versus very few, and you're enrolling lots of women versus very few, there's very little difference on quality metrics that we would normally ascribe to studies that are important. That's enrollment rate, protocol deviation rate, rates of loss to follow-up, and rates to follow-up out of window. We submitted this for publication at JAC, and we hope that it's going to be coming out in January. I got a very positive review, and I just sent back the revisions. But this is the first study to look at whether or not there seems to be a price to pay for enhanced enrollment of women and minorities at least in registries. And the stark answer to this question, based on our analysis, is there does not seem to be effects on study quality metrics, including enrollment rate and protocol deviation rate, for example. Another thing that we got out of this study was, I've shown you sites based on quartiles of minority enrollment, with big circles being the highest enrollment of minorities and small circles being the lowest. And you can imagine here in the Pacific West and here in the Southeast, you're going to see higher enrollment of minorities in terms of Blacks and Hispanics, and sort of in other areas, West, South, Central, West, North, Central, New England, et cetera, you're going to see lower rates. Now, why is this important? Because this is a predictor of study minority enrollment. And so if we're going to try to enroll more minorities in clinical trials, we probably are going to need to include more sites in areas in which minorities actually reside. It's a no-brainer, but no one's actually really studied this or talked about it. So this is a sort of a strategy on the front end of a clinical trial. You can actually look at a diversity index, and I'm working with the FDA now to come up with predictive analytics around if we know a site's prior performance in terms of demographics and enrollment of women and minorities, we're going to study if we can predict that in the future and how reproducible it is, and how how site selection can go into determining proportions of minorities and women and older adults that are enrolled. Interestingly, when you look at women enrollment, female enrollment, there's no predictor. If I showed you the heat map for female enrollment, all the circles are about the same. There's really very little difference. It's just a scatter plot across the country. So if we're strategizing enrolling more minorities, site selection is important. If we're strategizing enrolling more women, site selection probably doesn't make a difference, but other strategies to enhance enrollment for women will probably be necessary. Some important take-home messages. Just a few last comments and slides on diversity of the workforce. A recent study by the AAMC focused on the fact that Black men currently make up only 3% of overall physicians, and that's really an abysmal number. And I think we've got to do a better job at the pipeline for medicine, such that women, minorities, and the whole span of our U.S. demographic are enticed to go into medical fields. This is important, I think, because minority physicians are much more likely to practice in underserved areas. More than 50% of all the minorities in the United States are cared for by minority physicians. And it's been shown in multiple studies that patient-physician concordance might improve communication, trust, satisfaction, and compliance. So we're going to serve our nation. We really want to make sure that we're getting closer to looking like the demographic as much as we can. So this is just another study that shows if minority physicians, this is where they practice, and you can see that underrepresented minorities are much more likely to practice primary care and in areas where there's poverty and other lack of access to healthcare. Within cardiology, the numbers are perhaps even more stark. If you look at the US Cardiology Workforce, and this is from American College of Cardiology, the vast majority of physicians are either white or Asian, mostly white, Asians next, and only about 5% in cardiology are Hispanic, and about 3% identify as being African American. And so these are very low numbers, but when you look at the also the proportion of cardiology trainees who are female, the numbers really are quite interesting. This is a display of the proportion of all residents who are female. It's about 45%. This is a few-year-old data. It's 2015 to 2016. If you look at surgical subspecialties, these are the proportion of women in surgical subspecialties. Orthopedics around, just under 15%. Look at vascular surgery. About 40% of vascular surgery trainees are female. We'll look at cardiology. Overall, in cardiology, for general cardiology trainees, about 23% were female. If you look at interventional cardiology and EP, we're talking only a little bit over 5%. So it's actually a pretty dramatic observation to note that there are a lower proportion of women in EP and interventional cardiology training positions than there are in vascular surgery and urology. I mean, urology makes us look absolutely terrible. So just a stark reminder that we probably should be doing better. We need to do better. And especially since women have been shown to, if anything, treat female acute myocardial infarction patients probably even a little bit better than men for various reasons. We've got to make sure that these numbers change. And the ACC is putting forth a major effort. I really want to applaud them for their diversity and inclusion efforts under the leadership of Dr. Pappas. And I know Bob Shore has been involved in a number of efforts, not only in the ACC, but also within our task force, and he's done a great job contributing to this. And of course, Pamela Douglas and Quinn Capers, but they've really highlighted the importance of this, and in a recent article emphasized that moving forward, this is going to be important. From our paper where we reviewed disparities in TAVR, we also came up with some ways that we might be able to reduce some of these disparities. And if we look at the heart team and how we manage the heart team, access to the team, how the team interacts with patients in terms of being culturally sensitive, understanding concordant communication to patients, understanding barriers to care, if we address the clinical research factors that I've spoken to, and really go after primary care and the referral bias that exists, this is our only way to really improve access to TAVR and other technological advances in structural heart disease for underserved minorities and other underrepresented populations. I want to speak just briefly about some of the things that we're doing at IHVI. After the George Floyd's death, we really had some internal heated discussions around race and around inclusion. And the Heart and Vascular Institute felt that we wanted to do something significant. And I'm really pleased to announce some of the efforts that we've put forth. We've developed an anti-racism and equality task force within just the Heart and Vascular Institute. There are further efforts to address diversity and inclusion at the system-wide level. We are focusing on 4 areas: inclusion and representation in IHVI, outreach to the community, education and training, especially as it relates to underserved minorities in our surrounding areas, high school students, primary school students, and then we're also trying to address our own healthcare disparities. And when we've looked under the hood, I can tell you we've seen some interesting disparities that exist within Innova that honestly I didn't even really think about. For example, amputation rates according to race are really disparate, and there's certainly a lot more work that we need to do. And we're going to focus on not only regional and national, not only on regional healthcare disparities, but we have a lot of national efforts. Myself and others are interested in this and working with the FDA and other entities, TPT Registry, ACC, SCI, and other stakeholders, and as well as industry, to try to see if we can get this data out there, understand what are the impediments to treatment and where the disparities exist and how we might be able to break them down. So I'll conclude by saying that disparities exist in cardiovascular medicine. They've always been there. Disparities exist in healthcare in general. There are multiple complicated reasons for this. Although we tend to look at race and ethnicity, most of the disparities are primarily related to social determinants of health and zip code, frankly. Disparities contribute to differential outcomes, and reducing disparities will require multiple stakeholders, engagement from regulatory officials, research culture, research study designs, academic physicians, thought leaders, industry partners, patient advocacy groups, patient education and awareness, and of course, funding bodies for research, including government funding bodies. And I'll just leave you with these final thoughts. We need to think at Vcsqi what we want to do to play a role in this effort. How are we going to collect our data? How are we going to utilize that data? And how are we going to understand how this plays out in our state vis-a-vis the cardiovascular interventions that we offer our patients every day? So I want to thank you for allowing me to share this time with you. I guess we'll open it up for questions. I'll stop sharing my screen. And again, many thanks to Vcsqi for giving me the opportunity to present.
Wayne, Alan, just thank you again for taking, after a long, long day, and taking your time to share this information. It's hard to get. I've heard it several times, but each time I hear it, there's more questions and there's more information to try to get your hands around than trying to make sense of this. So just a simplistic question that I was struck on the Carroll County slide that you then came back to and again hit at the end. If I'm a African-American woman that has lived in a certain high-risk locale for 20 years, can I reverse my potential for adverse health outcomes if I move? Or is there a point at which it's now so embedded in me? And I guess where I'm getting is that can we really modify without having to move that locale? You look at Portsmouth south of Richmond, highest risk county in the whole Commonwealth. It seems like a lot of these resources could modify the locale.
Yeah, what an insightful question, and what a complicated question with a very complicated answer, as you can imagine. Here are some observations that I can leave you with, because obviously that's a question that we honestly don't know the answer to. We're starting to get our head around the cumulative effect of life stress, life's stressors, and we're finally actually connecting some dots. You know, there is a very clear connection between where you live, the stress that you experience, and stress hormones, catecholamines can now be measured, inflammatory markers can be measured, and we're actually seeing differences. I'll give you one example. If you look at infant mortality rates in first generation African women who come from Africa and move to the United States, you would think that infant mortality rates and premature deliveries and premature death of unborn infants would go down. It actually does the opposite thing. This is a fascinating observation. And, you know, stress hormones when you're pregnant probably affect the fetus, probably affect your ability to continue through pregnancy to the end of your term. And this phenomenon is only seen in African women coming into the United States. For the first generation, there's an increase. And then after that, generations afterwards, it seems to play out and equalize. So that's an interesting observation. I think that the answer to your question is probably yes, but there's going to be a cumulative effect of just living in stressful situations. that are governed largely by, again, your zip code mostly, that after which you're going to have some end organ effects that are irreversible. So if you've lived for 40, 50 years under extreme impoverished situations in a food desert with, poor access to healthcare, the stresses of now even people are even measuring the stresses of things like racism and various other factors that relate to social factors, you probably are going to end up with some end organ damage. And, simply moving from there to, Bel Air or wherever you want to move probably won't reverse that cumulative effect. But we don't know. And the problem is, how would you study this? What a difficult thing to study. You can't do a randomized trial. You're not going to have experimental data. You'll have to rely on observational data. And then, of course, everything that you study is going to be so wrought with bias. The people that can get out of those impoverished areas are going to be different than the people who are left behind.
Okay.
So great question. I think it's a very contemporary discussion. And I got to tell you, look out for the next 5 to 10 years for research that's going to relate life stressors to cardiovascular disease and cancer, because these things are all connected. And I think we're finally starting to connect the biology to the sociology, so to speak, and the social determinants, and understanding how the two could be related. And Clyde Yancey has some really neat slides on this, and he gives a wonderful lecture on this tie between pathophysiology and sociology that is probably connected through stress hormones and epinephrine, corticosteroids, and other factors.
Well, thank you again for these insights and for being with us, not just the Vcsqi, but in our practice, and the privilege of being together. It's been great, and looking forward to, I know you don't want to hear a lot more years, but it's, some time.
Yeah, and we'll see. I'll challenge the Vcsqi. I'm just getting to know what's under the hood. Eddie Fauner sent some really nice slides of demographics within our state relative to CABG and ABR. And there may be some interesting sort of questions that we might be able to address within this particular committee and this organization.
Dr.
Go ahead, Pete.
Yeah, sorry, Dr. Batchelor, that was a phenomenal talk. And I got to say, I learned a ton. Very, very interested in sort of the social vulnerability index and how it relates to county and sort of the geospatial aspects of that. Back in 2007, that I want to say it was one of the nascent impetuses for the Virginia Heart Attack Coalition was to address disparities in care because the Virginia Department of Health gave us a county by county layout of cardiovascular mortality. We looked at that and said, oh boy, if you're in this county, you're not going to do well. If you're in this county, you're going to do well. But I got to say, in retrospect, we were very one-dimensional in how we looked at that. I think we looked at it thinking, well, they just must not have great regional systems of care or access to PCI centers. We just need to work on that. But in looking at all of what you have presented, there's so much more to it that I don't think we really appreciated from a societal, racial, socioeconomic standpoint. So I guess this may be too broad a question for me to pose, and maybe we need to continue this conversation offline, but what do we do next? Are we starting to get a sense when you look at STEMI, when you look at shock, when you look at stroke, are we starting to get a sense that there's a whole lot more there that we need to address than access to a 24/7 center?
Yeah, there really is. And honestly, I think if you come at it from only one perspective, you're probably going to leave a lot on the table unchecked and untreated. Extremely difficult you can study these phenomenon, but I think, David Satcher's report on standardized mortality ratios, I encourage you to look up that paper from 2005. That is one of the most stunning observations that I've seen in a long time. The standardized mortality ratio between blacks and whites has not changed in 4 decades. And that's, a whole lot of talking and thinking and frank work to try to narrow the gap. I think we've done a much better job on other social aspects of of inequality than simple mortality. So when you look at STEMI, furthermore, we're just starting to, in my opinion, scratch the surface. I mean, as I do more research, I'm telling you, there are real differences that are, track relative to gender, race, and of course, social determinants of health that simply relate to platelets. I mean, whoever thought of that? We're going to now have to start talking, and because again, Black women make almost none of our clinical trial participants. We have no idea how clopidogrel works in a Black female who's having a STEMI versus a white man or a white female. Our work and Paul Goebbels' work really begs the question of whether or not the safety and efficacy assumptions that we're making are equivalent across all races, ethnicities, and perhaps even social determinants of health. We don't know. So I think, honestly, you have to kind of grab the low-hanging fruit. And I think because your mind starts to you just get a headache thinking about this stuff, Peter, as you can imagine. I'm sure you've gone through this yourself, is where do you start? I think just start with the simple things. Start with the things that you can measure. And what you can measure is access to healthcare, and you can measure timeliness of care, and you can start to look within healthcare systems at metrics that relate to how you're doing as a healthcare system. If you don't look, you won't have any idea. I'm just starting to find out some things about ANOVA. ANOVA is a great place to practice. It's a great institution, but like every other institution, we're seeing some really interesting findings by just simply looking at it. Clyde Yancey and others have actually said, we, as a part of our QI process, should look at how our outcomes track and how access to care and treatment decision-making is applied according to various factors that track with outcome, whether it's race, ethnicity, gender, and social determinants of health. We don't do that, but there are a lot of advocates who say we should, and that should be part of our QI process before we really start to answer the question of how well we're treating our patients. We should ask, how well are we treating our community, and is there equivalent outcomes across various demographic subgroups? So, great question, Peter. We're probably over a glass of wine or a beer or something. When COVID's over, we could have about an hour chat on this and maybe put together some ideas. But what a complicated question, but a very good one.
Great, thank you.
This has been really extraordinary, and thank you for your leadership in this whole topic. I think one of the things that we're learning also is the importance of implicit bias. And so I think the Vcsqi has a great opportunity both within the organization with each of us, but also how we can look forward and look at those disparities and how we might try to address them.
Great. Yeah, we're doing some of that at ANOVA, and I look forward to seeing where Vcsqi takes this, but I think there's great opportunities.
Other comments, questions? Wayne, really extraordinary. Thank you so very much. And Alan, thank you for asking him to talk about this.
Well, again, thank you again for sharing your time with me. And I may have to actually jump off shortly. I actually have to pick up my wife from the airport. So just social determinants of health are also related to how if mom ain't happy, nobody's happy. So I'm going to make my wife happy and pick her up from the airport shortly because it affects my outcome.
Thanks, Wayne.
All right.
Good evening.
Thanks, everyone.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Batchelor, again, and more to come on this important initiative. I think there's a lot Vcsqi can do, especially with our database in terms of identifying and then addressing these social determinants of health. But next on our agenda, we have Dr. Hunter Mahaffey from UVA, who is a cardiac surgery fellow. Hunter is a well-published author, both at UVA as well as Vcsqi. And tonight he will present his latest research leading the charge on addressing disparities in concomitant AFib ablation rates during mitral valve surgery. So Hunter, I'm going to pass you control of the screen and take it away, please.
Great. I start. Sorry, just want to make sure it's working. So thank you, Eddie, and thank you, the members of Vcsqi for giving the opportunity to present this data. You know, there's a couple names here on this slide, but this is really the data from Vcsqi, as well as survey data from the surgeons within the collaborative that took time to give us feedback and try to help us figure out you know, what people's opinion of concomitant AFib ablation is, where the current technology stands, and what we do sort of carrying forward. So I'll just kind of jump right into it. Let's see. Eddie, it's not letting me control. Any thoughts? May have to.
It does better if you like hover down to the left bottom window and use the arrows.
Got it. Thank you. Thanks, Sherry. All right, so just as an outline, so I'll briefly talk about where this work really started at, and the collaboration with the CTSN, and then talk about the recent publication out of the Vcsqi that we had looking at practice patterns across the state with the use of concomitant AFib ablation during mitral valve surgery. And then we'll talk about our implementation science based approach to this question, and the survey that we performed within the Vcsqi collaborative, as well as working with the Michigan Quality Collaborative to get more feedback from their surgeons as well. And finally, talk about you know, what targeted mechanisms we're going to be unveiling over the next 6 months to try to make some changes and reduce some of these barriers to entry for concomitant AFib ablation. And finally, I'd like to briefly touch on the great opportunity that using implementation science approaches for a number of topics across Vcsqi. So the CTSNet, the Cardiothoracic Trials Network, published a trial in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2016 looking at surgical ablation for AFib during mitral valve surgery. In that study, there were 3 arms. There was a control arm. There was a group that got pulmonary vein isolation, and then a group that got biatrial ablation. And what they showed is that there was a significant reduction in AFib long term, and that data really led to the 2017 STS guidelines, which stated pretty clearly that for patients with pre-existing atrial fibrillation who were undergoing mitral valve surgery, the recommendation was for those patients to undergo surgical ablation for their AFib at the time of their operation. So based on these guidelines and this level 1A evidence, did practice change? And that's really what our first publication was looking at. So looking at trends over time within the Vcsqi, and this graph on the one axis, we see the rate of AFib ablation over the time period, represented by the blue line. You can see that in fact, AFib ablation went down over the study period. There was a slight uptick in 2018, unclear if that continued. We'll have to look back at the data now that we've had another 18 months worth of data in the database. But importantly, we also looked at the rates of pre-op AFib, and we see that over that same study period, the rate of patients coming in with pre-op AFib actually increased. So this is only patients who are undergoing mitral valve surgery. So again, we would expect the blue line to increase, 1 from the guidelines and 2 from the compensatory increase in pre-op AFib, but that's not what we saw within our collaborative. So then we took a deeper dive and looked at rates of AFib ablation by center. So the 19 centers within the Vcsqi that had contributed data during this study period, are listed along the bottom 1 through 19 in order of highest mitral valve volume to lowest mitral valve volume. So while the graph does look busy, what it very clearly demonstrates is that volume was not really related to performance of AFib ablation. So there are high performing low volume centers and low performing high volume centers, just as with most things that we look at. So it wasn't really driven by the center volume or perhaps expertise at the center. So we took a closer look and tried to figure out if it was patient-specific factors that were driving whether or not surgeons were performing concomitant AFib ablation. What we found on univariate analysis was that lower risk patients were far more likely to undergo concomitant ablation. So these are younger patients, also had more persistent AFib as opposed to paroxysmal. These patients who were undergoing ablation had less comorbidities, less end-stage renal disease, less heart failure, less coronary disease. They were less likely to be a patient undergoing reoperative cardiac surgery. And this resulted in a significantly lower STS predicted risk score, 20% versus 28%. So I think that makes sense for a lot of surgeons. Even if you're doing mitral valve surgery and somebody with pre-op AFib, if they're very high risk, you're going to be more inclined to perhaps focus on getting that patient out of the operating room a little bit more expeditiously. When we looked at our data, we did see, though, that the patients, as would be expected, had better outcomes. They were lower risk, they had lower morbidity, mortality, shorter lengths of stay, and lower cost, as well as less AFib on discharge, 10% in the ablation group versus 53%. And these were patients who were documented as having preoperative AFib. And finally, when we adjust for the STS risk score, we see that concomitant AFib ablation, as it is performed in real life clinically, is not a independent predictor of major morbidity or mortality during mitral valve surgery. Obviously, that is limited by the selection bias from the retrospective analysis. But with the best statistical adjustment we can perform, the ablation itself is not independently associated with morbidity or mortality. So now we understand our practice patterns, and implementation science would then dictate that we next need to identify our barriers to implementation. So we performed a survey, as I mentioned. We surveyed all 135 surgeons within the Vcsqi, as well as the MST CVS, the Michigan Quality Collaborative Group. We had about a 50% response rate in the surveys. I really appreciate everyone taking time to fill these out. The surveys really focused on what you as a surgeon, what your experience was, what your practice patterns are, some case-based scenarios that looked at what patients you typically ablate, as well as your comfort with the various ablation devices in your training. So what we saw is that within respondents, 50% of the respondents had a broad adult cardiac surgery practice, whereas about a quarter of the respondents had a subspecialty focus on valvular surgery, with a minority performing cardiac, thoracic, and vascular. We saw that almost 3/4 of respondents reported that at their institution, mitral valve operations were centralized to one or a couple partners in their practice to sort of centralize and increase and have a couple high volume folks. And then, so of the respondents, 40% were that surgeon who does the mitral valve volume. So really, overall, what this tells us is the respondents to the survey, a good portion of them are the mitral valve surgeon in their practice that is doing a majority of these operations. So we're surveying the people that are most likely to be faced with this clinical question. Next, we ask surgeons what their self-reported volume was, and this correlated pretty well with what we see in mitral valve volume across the state, and where folks fall from very few folks performing more than 100 mitral valve operations a year, and a majority of folks performing 30 or less. As I mentioned, about a 50% response rate overall in the survey, and then specific questions, a majority of respondents reported they were comfortable using the different various devices, cryoablation, RFA ablation. However, surprisingly, there were over 12% of respondents that were unaware of the societal recommendations. We asked them specifically if they were aware of the 2017 guidelines, and I was surprised to see that there was a proportion of surgeons that were unaware of the guidelines. About half of respondents had received formal training in AF ablation, either through during their fellowship training or had attended courses to learn the technology. And then I think the final point here is actually a very important one. You know, we talked a lot about this question before adding it to the survey, but does the referring cardiologist discuss concomitant AFib ablation when they're referring a patient for mitral valve surgery who has pre-existing AFib? And I was personally surprised to see that almost 40% said that it was rarely or never discussed from the referring cardiologist, whereas only 10% said that it was always or usually discussed. So I think that a collaborative approach to this issue is important, and I think I'll get into this in a little bit, but I'd love to hear from some of the cardiology folks on the call what your thoughts are on concomitant AFib ablation and some of the downsides and what what we can do to improve the collaboration. So as I mentioned, we also looked at a survey of clinical scenarios. So asked surgeons how likely they were to perform a concomitant ablation, whether they were doing open atrial surgery like mitral valve surgery versus a closed atrial surgery like a CABG or AVR, and similarly whether they would perform a Cox maze, PVI, or just ligate the appendage. And what we see here, I don't know if people can see my pointer, but the folks, only about 50% said that they would always perform or nearly always perform biatrial maze in patients undergoing open atrial surgery, whereas a significantly higher percentage, nearly 80%, said that they would certainly clip that patient's appendage. So as you can see, there is some variation in practice pattern. I think some of that is due to the current levels of evidence and the approach of doing a maze versus a PVI. So I'll get into that a little bit more here in a moment. But just to finish up the survey results, almost 50% of respondents said that they felt that there were no barriers to implementation of these guideline-based approaches for concomitant AFib ablation during mitral valve surgery. And there was a significant proportion of folks who said that they were worried about the additional cross-clamp time, new arrhythmias, including heart block, as well as concern that their patients were too high risk. And I think that these are difficult questions to contend with, because while the STS guideline document kind of clearly states that all patients undergoing mitral valve surgery should be undergoing this concomitant ablation, I think there are certain patients that perhaps are too high risk, and I think that is still open for discussion and something that really needs a closer look, perhaps by the STS guideline committee, or even within Vcsqi, if we were to set up sort of collaborative wide approaches or protocols to use of this technology. Finally, the remainder were very small minority, didn't feel comfortable with ablation, did not have proper equipment or staff. And sorry, I really took off there. Eddie, is that you? I don't think I did that. I may have. Here, go back a little bit. Sorry. Everybody can still hear me?
So the next slide looks at what interventions folks thought would be valuable for us to implement. What ways we can improve support. One of the biggest and most common responses were that surgeons felt that increased support from cardiology or EP, and whether that is support, at the time of referral, support when, you're getting called post-operatively because the patients require a pacemaker, or what exactly that is, I think we can discuss further. But the other big areas were stronger evidence of benefit to performing this additional procedure, as well as surgical mentorship, education about the evidence, education about the techniques, and a financial incentive to perform the additional procedure. So when asked specifically what we could do, about a quarter of folks felt that site visits would be helpful. Obviously, that's going to be more challenging in the COVID era. Videos about the performance of the procedure, as well as proctors or mentors to discuss case selection, and then a much smaller proportion thought that simulation or additional lectures could potentially be helpful. So based on these results, which have been submitted for publication and just got reviews back from JTCVS, we have identified some targeted approaches to try to allow change. So I think the first question, one of the things that came up in the short response box at the end of the survey, was the concern over an increased pacemaker rate. And this is certainly a real risk. This paper was published in JACC last year. This is a secondary analysis of that trial data from the CTSN, looking at the pacemaker rate within the three groups. And you can see I have it listed here, a little over 7.5% in the mitral valve surgery alone group, 16.1% in the mitral valve and PVI, and a quarter of patients undergoing mitral valve and biatrial maze required a permanent pacemaker. And this is randomized trial data. Only 264 patients were enrolled in the trial, but this is randomized data demonstrating these outcomes. So as a step towards increasing clinical evidence, we're going to put together an STS national proposal to utilize the paired STS and Medicare database to examine this exact question. So looking at patients over the age of 65 undergoing mitral valve surgery, looking at the pacemaker rate between patients who got concomitant ablation versus those who did not. While this would not be retrospective data, I do think it would provide a much larger sample size and a real world experience to better delineate these numbers. Second, educational initiatives. So this started, Sherry and Eddie put together an excellent newsletter blast that has some of this same data I'm presenting this evening, that went out to all of Vcsqi, just talking about the guidelines, the trial data, and then as well as the Vcsqi performance rate for concomitant ablation. Additionally, we're putting together an educational video that will include open and minimally invasive approaches to PVI, full biatrial ablation, as well as performance of this procedure, performance of those procedures as a concomitant or a standalone approach in open and closed atrial cardiac surgery. So that video will be coming out hopefully over the next month, just as an additional resource for surgeons who are interested. And finally, to talk briefly about mentorship and support. We have identified some of the surgeons that participated in this work, Dr. Sarin up at ANOVA, Dr. Cotter, as well as Vinay Badwar and Gaurav Alawadi, who, these guys are all performing this procedure regularly, and we'd be happy to discuss case selection, review patients, and talk about sort of the positives and negatives of adding this extra procedure in patients undergoing mitral valve surgery. We're also working on the option for site visits for interested surgeons, obviously pending how the rest of the winter goes, and hospital restrictions with visitors. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, I would really like to open it up to get further ideas on collaboration between our cardiology and EP colleagues, and how do we take a heart team approach to this issue, and whether it's discussing it ahead of time, having it more on everyone's on the front of folks' mind when we're talking about these patients, or whether it's more on the post-operative end. But I would love to hear any feedback that or thoughts that anyone has about that. And finally, let's see, frozen up again. And finally, just the future directions for this project after we implement these approaches. We're going to do a pre-post to look at whether the rates of use of concomitant ablation increased during mitral valve surgery. We're going to follow up to do a follow-up survey to assess participant impression of support and changes in practice pattern. And finally, the last piece is, in my opinion, Vcsqi is an ideal setting to pilot these implementation science approaches and improve evidence-based practices. And I would be very interested in working with others who have other guideline-directed practices that perhaps are not as widely adopted, that we could do a similar approach within Vcsqi. So with that, I'd open the floor to any feedback on this project, thoughts for future collaboration, or improving this guideline-directed treatment.
Hunter, this is an excellent start, and I think it at least to me underscores just the frustration in dealing with this entire question, and because of the variation. Your presentation, however, it absolutely underscores that it needs a champion, whether it's in the institution, whether it's in the community, whether it's in the society, because there's, for people to say that we need more data. No, we don't. There's a extraordinary amount of data out there on the survival benefits, the stroke benefits, decrease in the arrhythmogenic cardiomyopathies, on the surgical approach with the MACE procedure. And so just as the mentorship, it's out there, the videos and the education, it's out there. If the individuals have the motivation to really learn more about this procedure. I think that the thing that's frustrating is that so many of the referrals for the MACE procedures are not from the EP doctors, because they've got their own bias. They've got their own sort of approach of catheter based. And so it depends on the institution and the electrophysiologist. So much of what we've done, we've got a high volume MACE practice, is concomitant both with coronary disease, aneurysmal disease, aortic valve replacement, much less open left-sided procedures. with no increased mortality with the reduction of the morbidities that you talked about, and it doesn't increase the risk for the procedure. I think that what is really been omitted in both this study, but for the society, for the database as well, is getting our hands around how the procedures are done, the energy sources, the standardization of approach, because there's so much both left-sided, right-sided, bilateral. Are you using cryo or radio frequency or both? And can we really come to grips with what the lesion sets and uniformity of that should be? That's not been in all the guidelines. That's not been able to be addressed, despite a lot of the work that Damiano has done in showing of these approaches. The second thing about the pacemaker rate, again, breaking it down into what the rhythm is on this patient population preoperatively, and then how that can be affected with the maze, the type of lesions, or what are the pacemaker rates if nothing is done. And then let's see, the last thing I had. Well, we'll stop there and let others weigh in. But I think getting the buy-in from the cardiology community and truly having a atrial fib core group of cardiologists, because the follow-up is also the key, and making sure that we're working together to see what the rates of atrial fib are after the maze, following it with a core group of individuals. Can we get them off of the anticoagulants? Can we get them off the antiarrhythmics? And then understanding what's the individual centers, not just performing the procedures, but following those patients post-operatively. And that would be the next, I think, the thing that a society like that, a group like this could really do, is to try to collect how we want to do that, and then what such savings we're showing and what the results have been.
So if I could chime in just a moment, I think the collaboration between cardiology and surgery, this is a perfect fit, and there is overlap. The issue of anticoagulation, and maybe we can have an offline discussion, is more from cardiology perspective related to the CHADS vascular, unless you've documented adequate isolation of the left atrial appendage. And I know when we do Watchman procedures, they come back a month or so later, 6 weeks, and they get a TE to make sure that the left atrial appendage is adequately and completely isolated. And I don't know whether that's necessary or has been done when you've got the ligator for the left atrial appendage in the future. And as far as whether you do the surgical maze or the pulmonary vein isolation, as I said, I think would be a perfect opportunity to collaborate with the cardiologists. And even if you did a randomized trial, or some other way that we could follow the patients.
Well, clearly having a group that are asking these questions and have a common interest that would be able to work together across the region would be ideal. It's just identifying those folks that really want to spend the time to ask these questions. So I agree with you, Robert.
No, I think that's very exciting, and I think that you make a good point about as you could see from the survey results, the surgeons are varied in their approach to who gets what ablations, and perhaps a more standardized approach where we're talking about things ahead of time and making a plan ahead of time, not only for the what operation the patient's going to get, but then what their follow-up will be, and then plans for any additional procedures needed, whether that's touching up in the EP lab and continuing with catheter-based ablation, or whether that's a pacemaker post-operatively, or whatever be needed. I think that would be critical.
We're glad to work with you and find alternative ways we can keep asking these questions.
I agree. This has been inspiring and a really wonderful conversation.
We're coming up on 7:30 here. Any other questions for Hunter? Other questions, comments folks would like to share?
Well, I guess hearing none, Eddie or Sherry, Alan, any last comments? Everybody stay safe. Have a wonderful, wonderful holiday. And Happy New Year.
Thanks for a great evening, folks. A lot of good work. Happy holidays to everybody.
Merry Christmas, everyone.
Thank you.
Holidays.
Thanks all. Take care.
Good night.
Good night.